The air in the barracks was thick, tasting of dust and stale sweat. For weeks,
The only rhythm had been the scrape of polish on leather and the rhythmic thud of boots on the concrete floor. Men sat on their bunks, staring at nothing, letting the desert heat press against their chests. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, a physical weight that made every breath feel labored. Then, the heavy metal door groaned open. Captain Miller stepped inside, the light from the hallway casting his shadow across the center of the room. He walked to the long table, the sound of his boots sharp against the floor. He dropped a manila folder onto the metal surface. The impact rang out like a gunshot, vibrating through the table and into the floorboards. Every head snapped up. Miller did not look at them. His eyes fixed on the map inside the file. He tapped the paper twice. Deployment orders. Iraq. We ship out in 48 hours. The room went dead. No one moved. The sound of the ceiling fans spinning overhead suddenly felt deafening. The boredom that had defined their existence for months evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by the cold, sharp reality of the mission. The silence did not hold. It fractured the moment Corporal Vance lunged from his bunk. He snatched his helmet from the cot and whipped it against the drywall with a guttural roar. The metal shell struck the plaster with a sickening crack, leaving a jagged crater in the wall. Dust drifted down like gray snow. "Finally!" he shouted, his voice rasping against the stillness. He paced the narrow aisle, his hands trembling as he gripped his belt. The other men watched him, none moving to intervene, their eyes tracking his movements like predators sensing a kill. The energy in the room shifted from shock to a raw, kinetic agitation. Men began checking their gear with frantic, jerky motions. A locker door was slammed shut. A boot was kicked across the room, clattering against the metal bed frames. The boredom that had kept them stagnant was gone, replaced by a volatile, dangerous edge. Every soldier in the barracks was a spring wound too tight, and now they were snapping. Vance stood by the dented wall, breathing in heavy, ragged gasps, his gaze fixed on the door, waiting for the command to move out. The echo of the helmet hitting the wall faded, but the tension lingered, settling into the corners of the bare helmet fine grit. The reprieve was brief. The unit was thrust back into the relentless, grinding cycle of the training base. For months, the desert sun had turned the facility into a furnace. The heat was a physical weight. Ha, 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 pressing down on the shoulders of every soldier until movement itself felt like a chore. The days blurred into an identical sequence of survival. Hours were spent hunched over benches, applying polish to leather with a rhythmic, circular motion. The scent of chemicals and dry earth hung in the air, thick enough to choke on. They ran laps until their lungs burned and their legs went numb, circling the perimeter of the base under a sky that never changed. There were no missions, there were no targets. There was only the sound of boots on gravel and the relentless, blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the sand. Every task was performed with mechanical precision, a hollow ritual designed to keep the mind from drifting. They polished until the leather shone like glass, then started again the next morning. The stagnation was a slow, invisible erosion of their resolve, turning soldiers into ghosts, trapped in a cycle of endless, pointless preparation. The lack of an external enemy turned the unit inward. When there was no one left to fight, they fought each other. It started with petty grievances, a misplaced canteen, a bunk left unmade, a line cut in the chow hole. These tiny sparks ignited the dry tinder of their collective frustration. In the common area, two men argued over a simple cleaning brush. Voices rose, sharp and jagged, cutting through the heavy air. The argument lasted seconds before a fist connected with a jaw. The sound was a dull, wet thud that drew every eye in the room. No one moved to stop it. The tension had reached a threshold where violence was the only language left. Men stood in the shadows, watching the struggle with cold, hollow expressions. The combatants wrestled on the concrete floor, kicking up dust, their faces contorted by a rage that had nothing to do with the stolen brush. It was a projection of their own trapped, useless energy. They were not soldiers defending a border. They were predators pacing in a cage, tearing at the bars. Every disagreement was now a potential brawl, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything other than the suffocating weight of their own inaction. The violence shifted to the showers, the only place where the men could find a moment of privacy. It became their battleground. Steam filled the room, turning the air thick and opaque, muffling the sounds of heavy boots on wet tile. Captain Miller walked in to find two men locked in a grapple, heads slamming against the cold wall. He pulled them apart, his own frustration mirroring their rage. But no sooner had he silenced them than a shout erupted from the stalls behind him. A second fight broke out, then a third. The sound of wet skin hitting concrete echoed through the tiled space. Miller waded into the chaos, shoving bodies aside, his voice barking commands that were ignored by the men in their frenzy. They were coiled springs, compressed for months, trembling with the force of their own pent-up kinetic energy. One snap, and they would break. When the last of the fighting died down, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The men stood beneath the lukewarm spray, chests heaving, eyes fixed on the floor. Their knuckles were raw, skin torn and bleeding. They were not looking at Miller. They were staring into the dark, waiting for the next tremor to shake them loose from their own restraint. The order to move arrived at dawn. The transition was rapid, a blur of cargo holds and the drone of engines. The company boarded the transport, the interior vibrating with a low, bone-deep hum that drowned out all conversation. For hours, they sat in the dim, cramped space, watching the horizon through the slivers of open hatches. The air grew stale, heavy with the scent of jet fuel and sweat. When the ramp finally groaned open, the rush of air was like a physical blow. They stepped out onto the tarmac in Kuwait, the heat rising in visible waves from the concrete. It was different here, sharper, drier, and smelling of scorched sand and distant oil. They moved north in a convoy, the land flattening into a vast, featureless expanse that stretched to the edge of the world. The men checked their weapons, eyes scanning the scrub brush and the rising dust clouds. The transition had broken the cycle of the barracks. The brawls and the shouting were replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. They were no longer waiting for a fight in a room. They were moving toward one. The silence of the desert seemed to promise that the waiting was finally over. The convoy did not stop at the front. It veered into a fenced enclosure, a sprawl of wire and dust that felt less like a staging area and more like a cage. The men jumped from the trucks, expecting orders, but were met only with the sight of other units already sitting in the dirt. They were processed, tagged, and shoved into a designated sector. The initial momentum of the travel vanished, replaced by the crushing realization that there was nowhere to go. They paced the perimeter of their assigned space, the ground hard and uneven under their boots. The command staff moved between them with clipboards, offering nothing but vague instructions to stand by. The intensity they had carried through the transit began to leak out, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its place. This was the trap. The hurry up and wait cycle had seized them again. They stood in the heat, watching the dust settle, and realized the war they had been rushing toward was now a distant, unreachable point on the horizon. Every minute stretched, thick and stagnant, until the sun began to dip, offering no relief, only the promise of another identical day in the pen. The hours blurred into a singular, sun-bleached experience. They sat on the sandbags, their backs pressed against the rough, woven material. Each man had a packet of rations, the dry contents clicking against their teeth as they chewed. It was a mechanical process, devoid of hunger or satisfaction. They stared out at the horizon, where the desert floor met the sky in a shimmering, indistinct line. Nothing moved. No dust kicked up from approaching vehicles. No birds circled the thermals. The wind carried only the fine, gritty taste of sand that coated everything it touched. Corporal Vance shifted his weight, the sandbags beneath him sinking with a dull crunch. He watched the heat waves ripple across the flat expanse, distorting the world until distance lost all meaning. The emptiness outside matched the stillness inside the pen. They chewed, swallowed, and looked back at the void, waiting for a shift in the light or a sound to break the monotony. But the desert remained mute. It was an endless, featureless theater where they were the only actors, and the play had been frozen in place since their arrival. They were trapped in a cycle of stillness, watching the sun track slowly across the sky, marking time without progress. Private Miller stood up, the sand crunching loudly under his boots. He found a stray shell casing half buried in the dirt and kicked it, sending it skittering across the hard-packed ground. It hit a plastic crate with a sharp metallic ring that cut through the heavy silence of the camp. He did not watch where it landed. He paced the perimeter of their small sector, his boots carving deep, jagged lines into the dust. Every few steps, he stopped, checked the ground, and started again. His hands were the most restless part of him. He gripped the stock of his rifle until his knuckles turned pale. The skin pulled tight across bone. He loosened his grip, flexed his fingers, and then clamped down again, harder than before. The repetitive motion was a way to burn off the energy that had nowhere to go. He stared at the horizon, but his eyes were not scanning for threats. They were searching for a reason to move, a reason to run, a reason to do something other than stand in the heat. He shifted the weight of his weapon, his arms stiff, his jaw locked against the rising pressure. He was a machine built for a specific purpose, now forced to idle in the dirt, the friction of his own inactivity wearing him down from the inside out. The restlessness eventually bled out of them, replaced by a heavy, thick lethargy. The heat did not just sit on their shoulders, it pressed down, forcing the air out of their lungs with every shallow inhale. It was a slow suffocation. The sky had turned a bruised, sickly yellow, and the wind had died completely, leaving the camp in a vacuum where sound seemed to struggle to travel. Captain Miller sat on a crate, his head tilted back, eyes fixed on the zenith, his chest rising and falling in rhythmic, forced intervals. No one spoke. Words felt too heavy to carry. To open one's mouth was to invite the dust to coat the throat, so they stayed silent, jaws clamped. The perimeter barriers loomed closer than they had that morning, the sandbags appearing to swell inward, shrinking the space they occupied. Every physical movement became a conscious effort, a fight against the invisible weight of the atmosphere. They watched the shadows of the tent poles lengthen, crawling across the ground with agonizing slowness. Time had ceased to be a measurement of events, and had become a physical pressure, squeezing the life out of the hours. They were waiting for something to snap, for the world to crack open and let them breathe, but the desert only held its grip tighter. The silence was no longer bearable. It was a taunt. Every man in the unit began to track the comms gear with a predatory focus. They did not want peace. They wanted the radio to scream. They wanted the static to vanish, replaced by the sharp, jagged commands of a combat engagement. Captain Miller stared at the receiver, his fingers twitching against his thigh. He was not alone in his hunger. Around him, the other men stopped staring at the dirt and started staring at the speaker. They were praying for a trigger, for a reason to unleash the pressure they had been carrying for weeks. The restlessness had curdled into a dark, iron-willed demand for chaos. They needed the noise. They needed the roar of an ambush to drown out the sound of their own hearts hammering against their ribs. One soldier reached out and nudged the volume knob, his hand hovering over it as if he could force the sound into existence by sheer will. They were coiled, desperate, and waiting for the world to break. Every second of silence felt like a personal insult, a denial of their purpose. They leaned in, ears straining against the vast, empty desert, waiting for the first crack of reality to shatter their isolation. The sky did not change. The wind did not shift. Then, a sound tore through the atmosphere, a high-pitched, metallic whistle that cut the air in two. It lasted a fraction of a second before the world vanished in a roar. A mortar round slammed directly into the command tent. The ground bucked upward, throwing dust and gravel into the air with enough force to sting the skin. A massive plume of black, oily smoke surged toward the clouds, blotting out the sun in a single violent stroke. The sound of the explosion did not fade. It hammered against their chests, leaving a high, persistent ringing in their ears that drowned out all human thought. Debris rained down shredded fabric, twisted metal, and burnt earth. The command tent was gone, replaced by a crater and a wall of rising heat. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. The shock held them frozen in the dirt, their lungs filled with the acrid taste of sulfur and pulverized concrete. Then, the ringing in their ears began to recede, replaced by the chaotic reality of the blast. The pressure was gone. The chaos they had prayed for had finally arrived, and it was heavier than any of them had imagined. The paralysis broke the moment Captain Miller stood and roared. His voice was raw, cutting through the thick haze of smoke and ringing silence. He did not ask. He commanded. The men surged upward from the sand, shedding their inertia like dead weight. Rifles were stripped from the ground, knuckles tightening around the steel. Corporal Vance was the first to hit the stride, his boots churning the loose sand as he sprinted toward the perimeter wall. The group moved as a single, jagged unit, driven by a desperate, newfound purpose. There was no time to process the damage or the crater left behind. They abandoned the stagnant piece of the holding pen, their breath coming in short, harsh gasps that mirrored the rhythm of their pounding feet. Miller pushed them forward, his arm extended, pointing toward the concrete barriers that offered the only line of defense. Every muscle was coiled and firing. They vaulted over low mounds of earth, boots sliding on the shifting surface, their movements erratic and fast. The transition was absolute. The boredom that had suffocated them for weeks evaporated, replaced by the sharp, singular focus of survival. They hit the perimeter wall, bodies slamming into the hard surface, rifles leveled outward at the horizon. They were ready. The hunt had begun. The palm grove stood across the clearing, a line of dark, swaying shadows against the heat haze. It seemed empty until the first muzzle flash blinked like a dying star. Then, the silence shattered. A rhythmic, staccato hammering erupted from the trees, tearing through the air with the sound of 1,000 stinging wasps. Rounds slammed into the concrete wall with a dull, heavy thud, spraying chips of rock into the air. Corporal Vance pulled his head down, the impact of lead against stone vibrating through the barrier. It was not a single volley, but a sustained, relentless wall of fire. Dirt kicked up in a line across the open ground, tracing the path of the incoming stream. Captain Miller yelled, but the noise swallowed his voice, turning the command into a distorted vibration. Every leaf in the grove seemed to be twitching under the force of the return fire. The air grew thick with the smell of burnt propellant and pulverized earth. There was no room to think, only the instinct to press deeper into the ground. They were pinned. The wall shuddered as another impact found its mark, sending a spiderweb of cracks across the surface. The palm grove was no longer a landscape. It was a throat, and it was screaming. Captain Miller kicked the concrete slab, his shout finally piercing the roar of the incoming fire. Move. Advance by fire. The command rippled down the line. Corporal Vance was the first to peel away from the wall, his boots slapping against the hard-packed earth as he sprinted forward. He dropped to one knee, leveled his rifle, and triggered a burst into the swaying palms. The recoil kicked into his shoulder, a familiar, grounding sensation. Around him, the rest of the company surged forward in jagged, uneven lines. They were no longer the bored men from the holding pen. They were a machine of movement and noise. Bullets kicked up geysers of sand around their feet, but they did not stop. They leaped over discarded crates and jagged rocks, their lungs burning with every inhalation of dust and sulfur. Miller was up, gesturing toward a cluster of trees, his arm cutting through the smoke. The men shouted, a raw, primal sound that competed with the rattling gunfire. They were doing what they had practiced for months, but the heat of the real engagement stripped away the precision of the training ground. It was messy, violent, and relentless. They advanced, step by agonizing step, closing the distance to the grove where the muzzle flashes flickered like dying embers. Vance peeled away from the main surge, his focus locked on the western edge of the grove. He needed an angle. He sprinted, boots skidding on loose gravel, his chest heaving as he sought the blind spot of the enemy. A fresh burst of fire snapped overhead, forcing him to drop low. He scrambled, limbs scraping against the rough ground, sliding into the shadow of a shattered concrete barrier. The world narrowed to the few inches of space behind the rubble. He pressed his back against the cold, jagged surface, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Dust coated his tongue, metallic and dry. Above the barrier, the air whistled with passing rounds, each one carving a sharp, lethal path. He gripped his rifle, knuckles white, listening to the rhythmic thud of bullets chewing through the debris just inches from his head. The heat here was suffocating, trapped between the sun-baked ground and the cooling concrete. He took a breath, held it, and waited for the fire to lull. He was alone now, separated from the roar of the company, the battlefield reduced to the inches of rock protecting his spine. He shifted his weight, felt the grit grinding into his palms, and scanned the gap ahead. Vance wiped the sweat from his eyes, his gaze flicking back toward the center of the line. He needed to coordinate the next push. He shifted his grip on the rifle, his joints aching from the tension of the last few minutes. "Hey, move up on the left," he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the relentless crack of gunfire. He crawled a few feet, peering over the edge of the barrier to find his squad leader. The man was sitting against a stack of sandbags, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle. Vance waved his hand, signaling for the order to charge. The squad leader did not move. Vance squinted, the sun glare blinding him for a heartbeat. He saw the dark, spreading stain across the front of the man's gear. It was deep, wet, and impossible to ignore. The man was slumped, completely limp, his rifle slipping from his slackened grip. Vance froze. The noise of the battle, the whistling lead, the distant shouting, the rhythmic thud of mortars seemed to drop away, replaced by the pounding of his own pulse. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the sandbags, and stared at the motionless figure. The reality of the moment locked into place, colder than the concrete shielding his back. The gunfire did not stop, but for the men nearby, the world went thin. The air grew heavy, thick with the sharp, acrid stench of cordite and the metallic tang of fresh blood. It settled in their throats, choking the shouts that had driven them forward only seconds ago. Every soldier in the immediate radius slowed, then locked in place. The frantic pace of the last hour collapsed. Where there had been a hunger for combat, a restless drive to prove themselves, there was now only the weight of the moment. They stood exposed, rifles held at half-mast, faces blank as the reality of the situation took root. The chaos of the palm grove continued to roar, but it was distant, muffled by the sudden internal stillness. They looked at the sandbags, then at each other, the illusion of glory dissolving into the dust. The adrenaline that had propelled them into the desert, the boredom they had been so desperate to escape, all of it vanished. In its place was the cold, undeniable truth of what they had walked into. The war was no longer an idea. It was here, breathing, and it had claimed its first price. They remained frozen, unable to bridge the gap between their recent recklessness and the stillness of the fallen man. Vance lunged forward, grabbing the man by his webbing and hauling him away from the sandbags. The body was dead weight, shifting with a sickening, limp inertia that dragged against the loose grit of the desert floor. Beside him, another soldier scrambled to grab the legs. Together, they heaved, their boots slipping in the dust as they turned toward the extraction point. Every step was a struggle. The man's arms trailed behind, scraping against the dry earth, while the soldiers strained to keep their balance under the uneven burden. Incoming rounds chewed into the ground around them, spraying sand into their faces, but they did not drop their hold. They moved in a jagged, desperate rhythm, forced to coordinate their footing with the dead weight they carried. Their shoulders burned from the effort, and their breathing came in ragged, shallow gasps that matched the frantic pace of the retreat. They did not look back at the palm grove. They kept their eyes locked on the distant line of the extraction point, pushing forward with limbs heavy from the exertion. The silence they sought to break earlier had been replaced by the rhythmic, jarring thud of their own boots and the labored sound of their lungs as they hauled the price of their boredom back towards safety. They reached the perimeter, sliding the body onto the flat, hard-packed earth. The gunfire from the palm grove continued, a constant, abrasive tearing sound against the horizon, but it seemed irrelevant now. One by one, the soldiers knelt, their hands coming away stained dark. The noise of the combat, the shouting, and the distant explosions were still there, yet they faded into a hollow hum. The silence emanating from the man on the ground was absolute. It was a pressure that pushed against their eardrums, far sharper and more piercing than the mechanical roar of the rifles. They looked down, seeing the stillness of a man who had been breathing minutes ago. The irony of their previous restlessness hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They had begged for this chaos, for this noise, only to find that the quiet of the fallen was the loudest sound they had ever heard. It stripped away the last remnants of their bravado. No one spoke, no one moved. The war continued to rage a few hundred yards away, but within their small circle, the world had stopped completely. The silence of the dead man remained, heavy and final, echoing louder than every round fired that day.